Welcome to the video review notes on foreign policy. Please make sure that you take handwritten, thorough notes on the handout provided in order to get credit for these notes. The first foreign policy in America was neutrality, and this is the foreign policy that will dominate for most of American history. Washington felt it was best to stay out of European affairs. He thought that our country wasn't strong enough yet, we didn't have enough men, we didn't have enough money to get involved in European affairs, and that if we got involved at all, then we would constantly be brought into their bickering and their wars. So in 1793, the French were at war with the British and most of Europe during the French Revolution, and they naturally, because they had helped us, they wanted us to help them in their revolution. And the Jeffersonians wanted us to do that because they felt we owed the French. The Federalists were more on the side of the British because of the economic ties we had to the British. But Washington issues the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793 and says that the United States is not going to take a side, and in fact that we are going to trade with everybody involved. The British don't really like this very much, and they begin to attack our ships, and we of course are unhappy about that. So Washington sends Jay to work things out with the British because we don't want to go to war with them. So he creates Jay's Treaty in 1795, and this is seen as very pro-British and pro-Federalist. We agree to repay all our war debts to the British, and in exchange, the British will allow us to submit claims for the illegal seizure of our ships, for the ones that they've already seized, not for future ones, and they agree to withdraw their troops from the Northwest Territory. This makes Spain nervous because it's perceived as pro-British, and so they work out the Pinckney Treaty with the United States in 1795, and they agree to give the United States access to the Mississippi River, the land of Western Florida, and the right of deposit, which is warehouses in New Orleans. Washington reiterates his belief that neutrality is important to the success of the country in his farewell address in 1796. Adams agrees with Washington's ideas on neutrality. However, the idea is challenged because the French are upset over Jay's Treaty and what they perceive as a pro-British attitude by the United States. Thus, they start attacking American ships. Adams sends over representatives to France to try to work out the issue peacefully. But when they arrive, they are encountered by French representatives who want a bribe before they can even sit down to talk about the issue. And Adams and the representatives from America are highly offended by having to pay to even sit down and discuss the issue. And this becomes known as the XYZ affair. Thus, the matter isn't settled, and we have a 2-year undeclared war with France. This is during this period, Adams passes the highly unpopular Alien and Sedition Acts, kind of taking advantage of the imminent war, or believed to be imminent war, with France to get rid of people that he thinks are undesirable, immigrants who would be against his party, saying that the country during war should have the right to imprison or deport people that they perceive as dangerous. The Alien Acts are never enforced during this period, but he also has the Sedition Acts, which prevent people from speaking out against the government, and this is really aimed at preventing the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's party, from speaking out against Adams because the Sedition Acts expire at the end of his term. These are enforced, and people are sent to jail over the sedition acts. In the end, Adams is able to avoid war with France. It's a popular idea to go to war, but Adams really believes that Washington was correct, that the United States needs to set a precedent that they don't get involved in European affairs, and that they need to maintain neutrality in order to create a stronger country. Adams pretty much sacrifices a second term in not going to war, because going to war would have made him immensely popular, and he wasn't all that well liked. But because he doesn't go to war, he's still not well liked and doesn't get reelected. Jefferson is in agreement with Washington and Adams that the United States needs to stay out of European affairs. He is so in support of neutrality that he decreases the military when he comes to office. One thing that you'll find about Jefferson is that he contradicts himself a lot as president. A lot of the things he said before he became president and policies that he criticized before he became president, he will later do the opposite. He finds that it's easy to pass judgment and be idealistic when you're a scholar, but it's quite another when you're president of the United States. Jefferson ends up getting involved in a foreign war. The Barbary pirates have been attacking United States merchant ships for years in the Mediterranean and demanding a ransom. And Jefferson refuses to pay it. And so the leader of Tripoli is angry that he's not getting his ransom, and therefore declares war on the United States. And the war ends up lasting about 4 years, and we end up winning and not having to pay tribute to the Barbary pirates anymore. Again, we face war with France and Britain. The French and the British are fighting one another and wish to draw us into the war. And Jefferson is angry that neither side is respecting American neutrality. And so what he decides to do is that our ships can't get attacked if we're not trading with anyone. So he places an embargo on trade in 1807. This becomes incredibly unpopular and highly criticized maneuver. Eventually, Jefferson will leave office in 1809, and the policy will be reversed. One of the major successes of Jefferson's presidency is that he doubled the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Louisiana had belonged to the Spanish, and we had made the Peace Treaty with the Spanish in 1795 to have access to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. In 1800, they had made a deal with the French to cede Louisiana back to the French. And the French then rescind the right of deposit at the port of New Orleans to the Americans. And this makes us a bit nervous because we need access to New Orleans. The Americans, because of their policy of neutrality and knowing that the French are a worthy adversary, that we would need to make an alliance with the British, and that's something that Washington warned against, was making permanent alliances. And so we want to avoid having to make an alliance with the British. And so Jefferson decides that he's going to send Livingston and Monroe to try to bargain with the French to see if they can buy some of the territory, at least access to the Mississippi River and New Orleans. Since the purchase of Louisiana, Napoleon has been defeated in Haiti by a slave revolution, and his troops have been decimated by yellow fever. He's also facing a war in Europe, and is afraid that if he loses to the British, that he might have to cede Louisiana to the British. So So he decides that he wants to get rid of his American empire and focus on his European empire. And so he agrees to sell the Americans the land for $15 million. And in the process kind of sticks it to the British because now they can't demand the land be ceded to them, and he's doubled the size of the country of their former colony. Now Jefferson agrees to buy the land, but in the process of approving it, he becomes worried because Jefferson is a strict constructionist. He believes that if the Constitution gives you the right, explicitly gives you the right to do something, then you can do it. Otherwise, you need to pass an amendment or you shouldn't do it, that's the right of the states. And there's nothing really in the Constitution about doubling the size of the country and how that works. And so he became very concerned personally that what he was doing was wrong. But no one else really seemed concerned, so he ends up not trying to pass an amendment and going ahead and adopting the new land. In 1823, the United States is experiencing a growing sense of nationalism as a result of winning the War of 1812 against the British. The United States had entered into the War of 1812 because they felt that they needed to prove the viability of democracy and of their country. So it's often called the Second American Revolution. But they also are, Americans, as a result of winning the war, feel like they've proven themselves a little bit and can demand a little more respect. The Monroe Doctrine is a policy outlined in President Monroe's annual address to Congress in 1823. In the Monroe Doctrine, President Monroe warns European countries that if they try to recolonize Latin America, that the United States will intervene and kick them out. Latin American countries have recently won their independence from the Spanish, but a lot of the new countries are not very stable politically or economically, and the United States is afraid that the European countries will take advantage of this. First of all, they want to support democracy, but they're also very concerned about their own safety and what European involvement in the hemisphere will do to the safety of the American borders. They're already concerned because the Russians are trying to move in on the northern border in the west. Now, this policy is only as good as the military that can back it up. And the United States pretty much knows that they don't have the military to back this up, and so does Europe. However, the British, before Monroe even issues this doctrine, have let the Americans know that they would be supportive of this kind of policy. And so other European countries know that the British are the ones really supporting the Americans militarily behind the Monroe Doctrine and agree to stay out of Latin America. The British are interested because they have a great deal of financial involvement in Latin America, and that would be challenged by another European country coming in and taking over. The Monroe Doctrine is not an official law. It's not even a treaty. It's a statement of policy. Some presidents follow it, and some choose not to, and some presidents add on to the Monroe Doctrine. This is an expression of American nationalism. It's also showing the American willingness to defend their hemisphere. And while it is threatening to get involved with other countries, so it seems not an isolationist or a neutral policy, what it is doing, though, is warning people to stay out of our hemisphere, and therefore it's sort of the ultimate idea of isolation. Everybody stay out of our hemisphere. So it is in keeping with the American policy of neutrality or isolationism. The idea of manifest destiny emerges during the antebellum period, and we discussed it in the antebellum video, and how it affects the issue of states' rights and leads to the Civil War. But it's also a bit of a change in American foreign policy. Manifest destiny is the belief of many American politicians and citizens that God destined them to control from sea to shining sea. So from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Some even went as far as that we should control the entire hemisphere, from the pole to the pole in the Western Hemisphere. This is a change in American foreign policy in some ways, and then in some ways it's not. In some ways you can look at this as imperialism. People lived on the land that American politicians and citizens thought that God destined us to live on. And so we go and we, through wars and treaties and violence and attacks on Native Americans, we end up taking all of this land. And so you could look at it as we had an imperial policy. It was ours. We were going to take it. But you can also look at this as another attempt to make sure that the United States stays neutral, especially from European affairs, through controlling at least part of the hemisphere. And that if we can control from sea to shining sea, that then it would be very difficult for anybody to mess with our sovereignty. As the United States continues to expand, the Europeans keep running into the same issue. They were not the first people in the Americas. That was, in fact, the people who were native here. And the natives, each time the United States expands, the natives move a little further west and get pushed a little further west and a little further west. And so it brings up clashes with the natives each time the United States expands. As we discussed in the antebellum video, Jackson issues the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and the idea there is that the natives, European Americans, want the natives off their land. They claim to be concerned about native culture and the natives having rights of their own. So they send them to the land in Oklahoma and Kansas. They think this will be far enough. This is out of the Louisiana Purchase and out of the land that the United States controls at that time. So they'll be far and out of the way of western expansion. But with Manifest Destiny, that ends up not being true. And so what you have from the period of the 1940s on is, as people move west, they encounter native tribes again, and you have wars with the natives, people killing natives for land, and new policies by the government putting natives on reservations and pushing them onto reservations. A book is published called A Century of Dishonor, which exposes the poor treatment of the Native Americans by the American government. And that sparks, in the 1880s, the Dawes Severalty Act. And the idea here is to take natives off reservations and to encourage assimilation. And the idea is that this is helping Native Americans and treating them better, but it also means that you're taking away land from the Native Americans and forcing them to assimilate into American culture, which isn't all that popular. You did what to the Native Americans? You want to conquer what land? Darth Cade is on the case. In the 1840s and 1850s, the United States pretty much acquires the rest of the land to the Pacific Ocean. In 1845, the United States annexes Texas. This had been a huge issue in the election of 1844, and it also serves to make the Mexican government very angry with the United States. In 1846, the United States reaches an agreement with the British over the border of Oregon. And in 1854, there is a failed attempt to take over Cuba. This is known as the Austin Manifesto. And the idea here was to buy Cuba from the Spanish, and if the Spanish wouldn't sell it, to fight a war with them over it, in order to establish a new slave state. The abolitionists in the North find out about this policy and end up putting a stop to it. All of this new land will come with the issue of whether the territory will be admitted as a slave state or not, and creates a lot of tension in the country. The Mexican government gets really angry with the United States over annexing Texas in 1845. And President Polk has his eyes set on gaining California and New Mexico from the Mexican government. He at first sends people to negotiate with the Mexican government to try to buy the land from them. And when that doesn't work, he sends troops to the Texas border, and he claims that the Mexican government was aggressive against the United States and they started the war. However, critics of Polk say that he was the aggressor and he really started the war. Either way, the Americans go to war with the Mexicans. The Americans end up winning and gaining the land in California and New Mexico. The United States enters a new phase of foreign policy in the 1890s known as imperialism. Imperialism is the process of taking over other lands for the benefit of the mother country. And this is something that the European countries had done for quite some time, but the United States had never really been involved in this, mostly because the United States had once been a colony and didn't really want to get involved in doing the same thing. Now, you can argue that some of the policies of Manifest Destiny were somewhat imperialistic in nature, or like just adding on to the country and creating a larger realm or empire was imperialistic. However, if you look at, say, the Louisiana Purchase, when the Louisiana Purchase was added to the United States, we allowed the people who lived there to keep French law, and we added them as states eventually that were on equal footing to all the other states. We didn't treat them as less than, and when we admit California later on, it's the same way. So in that regard, it's not imperialism. However, these new areas that we're going to take on are going to be treated as lesser in a lot of ways, and therefore can be considered imperialism. The United States also had not been involved in imperialism, especially in the 30 years prior to, because there was just too much else going on in the country. Recovering from the Civil War, industrialization, urbanization. We also still had the frontier. Manifest Destiny and moving to the Pacific coast was still a possibility. But in the 1890s, the frontier was considered closed based on the work of Frederick Jackson Turner, and therefore America needed new places to expand and new markets. So why imperialism in the 1890s? The biggest reason is markets. The American industry was growing, and there was a fear that the Americans could not consume all that the Americans were producing. So we needed new places to sell our goods. We also need to expand for naval purposes. We need naval bases and coaling stations all over the world for the purpose of trade and protection. And this is based on the idea of Mahan and the importance of naval power. Again, we need new areas to expand because the frontier is closed, according to Turner. We also no longer fear war as much as we did following the Civil War. People are moving on from that because imperialism is likely to create some sort of military involvement. There's also the ideas of white man's burden and social Darwinism. White man's burden is the belief that it's the white man's duty to go out and spread our ideals to other countries that are less developed and less fortunate. That we should teach them our ways. And it's a bit condescending if you think about it, that the Western way is the only way. But this is one reason why people think we need to go and expand into other areas. The other way is a little meaner, social Darwinism, that it's our right because our country is stronger and more powerful, and we have the right to take on the resources of those who are less powerful because we've developed stronger than they have, and that's the way the world works. One of the earliest cases of imperialism is in the 1850s in Japan. The United States needs coaling stations in Japan and wants to open up trade. So we send in Matthew Perry to tell the Japanese he'll be back in a year and they can decide if he should attack them or if they will make a treaty. And they decide to make the Treaty of Kanagawa, which gives the United States the right to trade with Japan, to establish an embassy in Japan, and sets up coaling stations in Japan. Alaska and Hawaii is our first acquisition of territory outside the continental United States. Alaska and Hawaii are imperialism in the sense that we're moving outside our continental borders. However, Alaska and Hawaii end up being admitted as states on equal footing to all other states, and therefore may not be considered imperialism. Alaska is acquired in 1867 in a transaction known as Seward's Folly. It was seen as we were acquiring a frozen tundra. However, Alaska ends up having a lot of natural resources and adds a lot of land to the country, so it was not as foolish as originally believed. Hawaii is a bit of a different story. Hawaii became important to the United States because of American investment in Hawaii. And when the United States passed a tariff, which was going to make it more expensive to import goods from Hawaii, the United States began the process, or businessmen associated with Hawaii wanted to annex Hawaii so that it would be cheaper to import goods. President Cleveland ends up refusing to annex Hawaii in 1892 because he feels like the Hawaiian people don't want it, and that's been forced on them by American businessmen. However, we will later annex Hawaii in 1898 in order to help protect the Philippines, which we have also annexed. The United States goes to war with Spain in 1898. We get involved in protecting the Cubans in their independence movement from Spain, and are drawn into the war largely due to propaganda surrounding the explosion of the USS Maine. The Maine explodes and the Spanish are blamed for it, and there's all sorts of propaganda in the newspapers, yellow journalism, about the explosion of the Maine and how it's the Spanish fault. In the end, it wasn't the Spanish fault that the Maine exploded, but we end up going to war with the Spanish. Out of that war, we win, and we get, and Cuba gets their independence, and we get Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines. Initially, the United States issues the Teller Amendment, which guarantees that the United States will not annex Cuba and will respect their independence. However, as we become more imperial-minded, the United States is concerned that maybe we jumped the gun on the Teller Amendment, so they issue the Platt Amendment, which says that the United States has the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. And so they are not as independent as they initially hoped. So the United States is highly involved in making decisions economically and politically in Cuba. The Philippines brings up a huge debate about imperialism in the United States and whether we want to get involved in annexing other countries and becoming an imperial power, and what kind of laws apply, and will those people be given the same rights as American citizens. And in the end, the United States decides to annex the Philippines, using the argument of white man's burden, that the Filipinos need us to be successful and to protect them. And so this is the first case of the United States going in, annexing, but not giving them the full rights of citizenship, and using the concept of white man's burden. The United States also is concerned about trade with China. China is a huge country, it's a huge market, and the European countries are fighting over access to China. The British had gained access to China during the Opium Wars, and then following that, the French, the Germans had all gone in, the Russians, and made their own unequal treaties with the Chinese. And the United States, not being an imperial power at that time, had kind of missed out on this, and they don't want to see China be under the control of one country. So they negotiate with the other countries the open door policy, where everyone is allowed to trade with China. President Teddy Roosevelt ends up expanding the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. At this time, Latin America has acquired quite a bit of debt to European countries, specifically the British and the Germans. And in order to collect those debts, they are threatening to get involved in Latin America. And again, the United States is worried about threats to the United States and letting the British and other European countries come into Latin America and be so close to the United States. What TR says is that if a Latin American country owes large debts to Europe, that the United States has the right to get involved and figure out and restructure the debt to keep the Europeans out. And this establishes the United States as the bad neighbor, because they're constantly sending in Marines and getting involved in the economies and the politics of Latin American countries, often without the Latin Americans really welcoming or wanting that kind of intervention. In the early 1900s, the need presents itself for a Panama Canal. The United States has spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and it will make trade easier if they don't have to go all the way around the southern tip of South America. And so the United States wants to dig the Panama Canal. However, they had signed in the past a treaty with the British that prevented one country from creating a canal, and then they don't have the land to build the canal. So Roosevelt, first of all, negotiates a treaty with the British that they can build the canal. And then he negotiates with first the Colombians, and the Colombians won't give them the land in Panama to build the canal. They want more money. So the Panamanian people revolt. Roosevelt doesn't make them revolt, but he doesn't tell them it would be a bad idea either. And then we buy the land to build the canal from the Panamanian people. President Taft introduces a foreign policy known as dollar diplomacy. How he wants to spread American interest and authority abroad is through investment, through Wall Street investment, private businesses. The more we invest in another country, the more influence we have over that country is his idea. In 1914, Europe goes to war with one another again, and the United States is determined to remain isolationist and neutral in European affairs and stay out of the war. Americans were so determined to stay out of the war that a big reason why Wilson was reelected in 1916 was the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Wilson promises to stay out of the war and do whatever he can to remain neutral. However, in 1917, he is forced to declare war as a result of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman telegram. After getting sucked into World War I, as the Americans perceive it, they are bound and determined to stay out of another European war and to remain isolationist. So the period of the 1920s and 1930s is highly focused on staying out of European affairs and protecting and maintaining American neutrality. This is going to become incredibly important, especially after they enter into the Great Depression after 1929. After the war is over, the United States refuses to join the League of Nations, citing Washington's argument that the United States should not enter into long-standing alliances with other countries. In the 20s, they try to outlaw war with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And in the 1930s, as tensions begin to heat up in Europe again, in order to prevent the problems that led to World War I, the United States Congress passes neutrality acts, essentially trying to legislate neutrality, saying that the United States can't really do business of any kind, loan money, or trade with countries that are at war. And that's the Neutrality Act of 1935. Now, as the war heats up and things become a bit more touchy and it becomes clear that there's a good side and a bad side to the war, the United States issues the Neutrality Acts of 1939 that allow cash and carry. So those countries that we support and want to help out, we will sell them weapons as long as they will come to our country, pick them up, and pay cash for them, because we can't loan them money and we can't transport goods to them. While the country still tries to remain neutral, by 1940 and 1941, again, it's growing clear that there's a good side and a bad side, and that Britain and the Soviet Union need our help. And so the United States adopts the policy of lend-lease. Again, we're not supposed to be loaning anybody money, and we're not supposed to be trading with belligerent countries. So what we do is we lend them the weapons until after the war. I know, you're getting bored. You're tired. You feel like this. It's almost over. Only a few more to go. In the past, when the Americans had fought a war with Europe, after it was over, they returned to a period of isolationism and neutrality. However, after World War II, that wasn't possible because there had been a huge shift in the role of the United States in the world. With the dropping of the atomic bomb, they were now the most powerful country in the world. Their industry had not been destroyed because there had not been fighting on American soil, and they possessed nuclear capabilities. Therefore, they really could not return to a position of isolation and neutrality. After World War II, the United States joins the United Nations, violating their pledge to never get involved in long-term alliances with another country. They enter into a permanent alliance, which is the United Nations. This is all, of course, to prevent the spread of communism. And from 1945 to around 1963, this period of the Cold War is known as brinkmanship, meaning the brink of war, and also containment, the idea that you want to contain communism to where it already exists. And things that support the idea of containment are the Marshall Plan, where the United States is going to give money to European countries in order to recover from the war, and the other purpose of that is to keep them from turning to communism. the Korean War, where they're going to stop the spread of communism in Korea and clash with the Chinese and the Soviet Union. The Berlin crisis, where the Berlin Wall is put up between East and West Berlin because the Soviets are upset at people trying to escape from East Berlin. And then, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest the United States ever came to hot war with the Soviet Union, where they had nuclear warheads in Cuba. And so we blockade Cuba, and the Soviets try to break the blockade, but end up turning around at the last minute. The period from 1968 to 1979 is known as détente. This is the cooling off of tensions in the Cold War. You have Vietnamization, which is trying to turn over the war in Vietnam to the Vietnamese people, and SALT I, which is an arms limitation treaty with the Soviet Union. This all comes to an end in 1979 when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. When Reagan is elected in 1980, he makes crushing communism a major goal of his presidency. Reagan is strongly anti-communist. This is part of his neoconservative views, and he wants to bring an end to communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The way that he proposes to fight communism is through a huge arms buildup. He believes that the United States economy is much more able to handle the price tag on an arms race than the Soviet Union is, and he ends up being correct in that matter. He proposes a complex arms buildup known as Star Wars. In the end, Gorbachev comes to power in the Soviet Union and in 1985, and Gorbachev wants to reform. He's still a communist, but he wants to make changes. And one of the things that he acknowledges is that he can't really make the changes that he wants to make as long as he's trying to engage in an arms race with the United States. And so they begin to back off the arms race in the mid-1980s. And eventually, Gorbachev's policies, as he begins the reform movements, the people in the Soviet Union want more and more reforms, and eventually the Soviet Union will fall. Communism falls under President Bush, beginning in 1989 with Poland and Eastern Germany, and this is people celebrating on the Berlin Wall after the fall of the East German government. And then once most of the satellite states, communism falls apart in the satellite states, it then in the early 90s, 91 and 92, falls apart in the Soviet Union. And so communism and the Cold War become less of a concern in the United States. Now, with that has huge implications for foreign policy, because first of all through the Cold War, what kind of governments the United States has supported all around the world have been not communist. And so we've allowed a lot of people to come to power that don't really have the same democratic free market ideals as the United States, but they weren't communist. And so the United States has to clean up those messes. We've also invested a whole lot of money in the arms race, and that's created a huge debt. And we've had a huge standing army, and so a lot of bases are going to close and people are going to lose their jobs. And also, we're not going to spend as much on defense contracts. And so, again, companies are going to go out of business and people are going to lose their jobs. So this has a huge effect on the American economy and our foreign policy. In 2001, a new problem emerges for American foreign policy, which is terrorism, as a result of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center in New York City. As a result of September 11th, 2001, President Bush creates the Department of Homeland Security, which is to protect American borders from terrorism and to seek out terroristic threats at home and abroad. And we enter into a war in Afghanistan in 2001 against the Taliban because we think that they are hiding Osama bin Laden. There are two approaches to foreign policy: multilateralism and unilateralism. Multilateralism is when a country acts with the support of other countries. So anything that the United States does with the support of the UN, whether it be entering into a conflict like the Persian Gulf War in the early 90s, or whether it be entering into trade agreements, that would be considered multilateralism. Unilateralism would be when we act on our own, like Iraq in 2003. That was unilateral. We did not have the support of the UN in invading Iraq. And there are debates and merits to both. Multilateralism, it's argued that in the global world that we live in, countries need to act together in making policies, and that we need the support of other countries when we go to war. However, there's also the argument for unilateralism, that our country has the right to do whatever we need to do to protect ourselves, and other countries may not respect that need or see the threat that we do, and may not want to become involved, but it's important to us. And remember, this can apply to both war and trade policies, agreements on the environment. Those all are encompassed by foreign policy, although the most popular thing we talk about with foreign policy is war. And that concludes Foreign Policy Video Review.